Welcome to the Neuroveda podcast for complex health. We feature expert guests who dive into ancient and cutting edge understandings of health and disease. These conversations are about food, lifestyle, and medicine just as much as about nature, culture, and politics. I'm Jillian Ehrlich, family nurse practitioner, certified in Ayurveda and functional medicine, coming to you from our clinic, Neuroveda Health, here in Seattle, Washington. And I'm really excited to introduce you to our guest today, I should say our author today, because we don't have a lot of patients with the conditions that we talk about so much. And so she is not only an author, but she's a patient herself. And this is Rachel Riggs. She's the author of an incredible new cookbook called In Good Health, which is available to Amazon, Elliott Bay Books, or Orca Books, your small local bookstore. It's a California style light and fresh cooking cookbook. But the twist here is that she's been suffering with ME/CFS, myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome, that started in 2003 and then had what is the unfortunately typical course, which was waxing and waning for about 12 years before getting her diagnosis, and then had a major exacerbation and has now been housebound, even mostly bedbound, for the last 13 years. So if you're watching this, it's why you can see my face and not hers. She's coming to us from her bed in her jammies. She's a former specialty food shop owner whose life was upended by ME, and she had to sell her shop. She's also worked closely with Dr. Robert Naviaux, who's an MD in San Diego at University of California, San Diego, as his study coordinator for the last 9 years. And if Bob Naviaux, is of the cell danger response fame, and he's been doing a ton of metabolomics and really critical research into the origins and the progressions of all different kinds of complex and chronic conditions. So, Rachel, we're so happy to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
So can you give us your story? Like, what did this look like for you in terms of how did this happen? When did you realize something was, it wasn't just like a flu, you were going to like get worse and then get better? Like, talk to us about how this happened for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually a pretty common story in the MS or ME rather community. I got a common virus. It felt like a cold, only maybe a little bit worse, and it just triggered something. I was just never better. So before that, I was 37 years old and had what I would consider really hearty health. I was, as they say, living my best life. I was super active. I discovered Alaska and really fallen in love with Alaska and was hiking all over Alaska and flying all over in float planes. And I took annual hiking trips to Utah and traveled and just did all the things and was living a great life when I just happened to get a cold that triggered something in me. And so initially there was a little bit more of a waxing and waning, and also it wasn't as severe. It's what is considered slow onset. The symptoms were so disparate that, I mean, it was just confusing in the beginning. I thought, I need to snap out of it. Is this a midlife crisis? Like, get over it. It was really hard on myself because the symptoms were so disparate. I, for example, didn't know what kind of physician to see. I couldn't pin anything down. And now, of course, I have a lot more language to describe those things. Now I understand that some of that was orthostatic intolerance, and I have these medical terms, but initially it's just confusion. So that's what happened in the beginning. And I eventually did start seeing physicians, and they had a hard time pinning anything down. And it wasn't until I had this huge exacerbation in 2012. I was a specialty food shop owner. I had to sell my shop. I was too sick to work. And I ultimately went to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester for a couple of weeks and left there with an ME/CFS diagnosis, a hyperadrenergic POTS diagnosis, and then only later was I diagnosed with MCAS and also EDS. So,
Mast cell
overachiever, I
activation.
want the whole collection.
And I just want to say MCAS is mast cell activation syndrome, EDS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. And they cluster together oftentimes, right?
They do. They do. They do. And we call that so it was a classic triad. And the classic triad was dysautonomias, or dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system. It's got those two legs to it, the parasympathetic, the rest or digest, or the feed and breed. And it's got the sympathetic, which is the fight, flight, or fright. And our nervous system is supposed to kind of switch back and forth between its priorities. If we need to jump out of the way of of a saber-toothed tiger, our sympathetic nervous system jumps into action. But then the rest of the time, we really should be living in that parasympathetic. But when that nervous system no longer is able to accurately perceive, then we get dysautonomias. And The one that we get I think that gets the most airtime is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS. But there's hyperadrenergic, means that as your heart rate goes up, so does your blood pressure versus your blood pressure dropping. And so that's that hyperadrenergic POTS. The second part of the triad is the mast cell activation syndrome, which is when the mast cells, which are a part of the immune system, are overactive. And it can look like allergy, but it's like allergy to the world. It's like you can't tolerate walking down the detergent aisle in the grocery store, or the windows are open in the summer and you smell somebody's barbecue and suddenly you break out in hives. So that's mast cell activation syndrome, and it can affect all parts of the body because we have mast cells all over our body. It's a lot of skin, GI, respiratory, asthma, interstitial cystitis, or bladder pain. And then the third in the classic triad is EDS, or Ehlers-Danlos, which is a type of connective tissue disorder, and it can be genetics. Although for the hypermobile type, we don't necessarily have genetics pinned down. Um, and so we may or may not have the actual genes, but if you've got connective tissue issues, which can be lax joints like hypermobility, like you did party tricks as a kid, or your elbow bends backwards like mine does, that can be hypermobility is one piece. But Ehlers-Danlos is kind of beyond that, and you can think of the connective tissue not having good membranes throughout your body. So cellular signaling is off, which can mean a higher resting tone for inflammation, and things can kind of move out of the places that they're supposed to. And so, to this triad of autonomic dysfunction, or POTS, hypermobility, or Ehlers-Danlos, and the mast cell activation syndrome, we've now added kind of this Pentad, which is chronic infections, long COVID, Lyme, reactivated Epstein-Barr virus, craniocervical instability, tethered cords. So those are structural abnormalities that can happen in the system. And then there's autoimmune activity. So autoimmune activity is very, very common, and that's also part of this pentad. So this can be gastroparesis, this can be GI issues, this can be small fiber neuropathies. So lots of big words in there. What did you feel like? What did that look like? Everybody's tired. So what made yours different?
I felt I was sick differently back then than I am now, but just overwhelming fatigue. It's not fatigue isn't even the right word. It's just that any kind of activity, whether it be cognitive activity, emotional, physical, it all comes with a really punishing payback, like a really unimaginably punishing payback. So I don't think there's any context for it for anybody that doesn't have ME. But I mean, think of the worst flu you ever had and how your body shuts down, and that's the closest you can come, but that's not usually a state that persists. So we have that in perpetuity. So yeah, the activities, I have prioritized preparing food because I also have mast cell activation syndrome, and that has kind of dictated. It's created a lot of food intolerances over time, and that wasn't the case initially. That took a long time to set in. So I know some of these things can be progressive, and I know the course is different for all patients. But for me, it took a long time to set in. But when it did happen, yeah, I suddenly found myself um, being, as you said, it's not like a standard allergy, but having allergic reactions to food that I'd always tolerated. So I had to make really drastic changes to my diet. So yeah.
One piece that I love that you're saying is like you really had to make choices around kind of your activity levels in the day. And, what I know from seeing patients for so many years is that it really is about anything that kind of comes into your sensory bodies. And so, for example, we haven't talked about this, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that even though you sound kind of like I sound, you're like a normal sounding person right now. My guess is that even recording this podcast is going to have some kind of like reverberating ripple effect in your health for days to come. Is that right?
Yes, there's going to be a price to pay, and there was a lot of groundwork leading up to just having this conversation, making sure that my sleep hygiene was really tight, my diet was really tight. I took a steroid this morning so I could have this conversation. And when I'm not talking and you're talking, I'm going to be doing box breathing and I'm going to be hydrating. And so that's another reason to be off camera. And so the energy that you are hearing, it's not, I think the best way to describe it is it's not clean energy. It doesn't feel good. It's not clean energy. It's me tapping into adrenaline, which is going to be injurious. I'm going to have to recover from that. So yeah, I think it's a hard to articulate, but it's just not clean energy. Reaching deep to a place that is not supposed to be tapped to find the energy to have an hour-long conversation.
Yes. And so if you're listening, the way that you can support Rachel is go buy her book. Like it's a sacrifice to, even record this conversation. But again, one of the other characteristics I just want to highlight before we dive into the food, which I'm very excited about. But I also want to highlight that, it wasn't like you were depressed or things were going poorly in your life. It was like you had a big life that you loved. And I
Yeah.
can understand that what I know from patients is that you're constantly making sacrifices about what things you want to accomplish in your life versus what sacrifices you can make. So, for example, we've just talked about that you're going to feel shitty for an extended time after recording this 1 hour. You've
Mhm.
prepared as best you can, but again, you're doing it because we have to live a life. And so I think that's very common experience for folks with ME, and I just wanna call it out because I don't think it gets recognized in the 1 hour that people listen to you talk and say, "Well, she sounded pretty good."
Yeah, I appreciate that, and you're right, the choices have to be made, and sometimes, especially when it comes to social interaction, it's like choices are made because it's such a salve for the soul, and you want to maintain those contacts with the people that are important, so sometimes you're like, "Okay, I schedule a conversation with a friend that I know is gonna be injurious," but it's so worth it because you just want that connection and you miss your friends, so, yeah, those choices are made all the time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for being here. We really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
thank you.
Hearing your story. So, and then the next piece, so I want to move into a little bit about another thing that I found so fascinating that you said, which is that when you had to make these choices and kind of clearly, which breaks my heart, cut out, hiking in Alaska and hiking in Utah and, all this travel, you went back to real basics, which is food. And so, can you talk to us a little bit about what that looked like for you and what that looks like now? And kind of how did you even decide to like make a cookbook, write a cookbook?
Yeah, well, I was seeing a functional medicine doc. I wouldn't have expected, elimination diet talk with maybe a more mainstream doc, but we were searching and searching for answers, and she ultimately suggested that I go on a really stringent 3-month elimination diet. And I thought, well, I got this. I mean, I know my way around a kitchen. Sure, let's do it. But that just wasn't the case. It's a pretty big deal to make a paradigm shift to your diet, and there's a real steep learning curve. But when you get desperate and you're really sick, you'll do anything. And so, okay, so we started making those changes. It's just sustenance, right? Okay, salmon, avocados, green juice. It takes a while to get your footing. I really thought my life in food was over. And it was like a bit of an identity crisis, even because I was so tied up in the whole food industry, but desperate to get better. So, anyway, it took a while to get my footing. But when I started developing really great recipes, which I also didn't expect. I mean, I expected it was going to be, as we call around here, jail food, forever. And then when I started developing some really good recipes, lit that fire to want to
Mm,
share them and to keep going. And I just kept developing more and more recipes, not with the intention of sharing them, but initially, just having to feed myself. So once I had a fairly substantial collection, I knew that it was something that needed to be shared with other people because I didn't have a resource. So when my doctor proposed this elimination diet, of course I looked for resources, but there just weren't any that were a super good fit for me. Most of the paleo, there's all these various levels there's paleo, there's AIP, paleo, which is much stricter, the autoimmune protocol. There's something called Whole 30, which is a really great resource. But none of those books were a great fit for me. They were heavy on really brown foods, lots of paleo isn't like it used to be, but it was once like very meat heavy. Like that was kind of the only way people did paleo back then. And so those things just weren't for me. And so I had to create my own dishes. And that ultimately led to the cookbook.
amazing. And so tell us about like because actually if you go online and you look at In Good Health, it doesn't look like a cookbook for bedbound sick people. Like, I
Yes.
don't know what that would
So
be, but it looks like I mean, it looks like you've written for, like, a San Diego crowd that's, like, going boating on the weekend.
yeah, I mean, I do think it's a very kind of Southern California book, but
Yeah.
but that was with intention. I mean, that's just kind of how I like to eat, but also I wanted to celebrate what's in it rather than what's left out. There's a very long list of foods that have been omitted. And should I share that list?
Please, I'd love
Okay, so it's free of gluten grains, pseudo grains, which are things like quinoa. People think of those as grains, but really they're seeds. So pseudo grains, dairy, soy, nightshades. Nightshades consist of eggplant, tomatoes, peppers, and potatoes. Legumes, squash, spinach, pork, shellfish, refined sugar, artificial sweeteners, cashews, and peanuts. So it celebrates what's in the book and not what's left out. There's a long list here, right? But the truth is there are many, many other ingredients to work with. And so it was important to me, being a cookbook lover, that mine looked like every other modern best-selling cookbook. I hired one of the top team photography and styling teams in LA to shoot it. And yeah, I wanted it. We deserve a resource like everybody else, right? Not some
And it's
sort of
gorgeous.
not some dumbed down version. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So yeah, so it was with a lot of intention. And then, of course, I brought my minimalist sensibilities to the mix. I'm a pretty hardcore minimalist. I wanted to cut all the clutter from, I mean, it's still cooking, right? It's not opening a tub of hummus. And people have to understand that that will be a barrier for some, but I am very much a minimalist. I bring those sensitivity or sensibilities to the book. Anything that's not absolutely necessary, an ingredient that doesn't really add something, a step in the process that isn't critical, those are all removed. Yeah, so I'm super excited about it. It's got a lot of desserts because
Mhm.
that's the other thing is like, okay, anybody can do anything for 2 weeks, but how do you make it sustainable? And something comes to mind, and that's the cabbage soup diet. And you're probably too young to know about the cabbage soup diet, but anybody can do anything for 2 weeks, but what if you want to do it forever? So dessert was a big piece of that. And
Mhm.
so all the desserts in the book are almond flour maple syrup based. They're almost all made with a single bowl and whisk. And yeah, it's like a real balance so that it's something that can be sustained for a long
Mhm.
period of time.
Fantastic. And so when you were going about kind of with this exploration, what were some of the foods? Like, how did you find foods that were free of all those things? Like, what is left? How did you think about that?
Well, I mean, the truth is, even though you remove all those foods, plenty of foods are left, right? There's thousands and thousands of foods to choose from. And not every cookbook would use every food anyway. So the truth is, it's not that difficult. But the way that I went about developing recipes, sometimes it came down to cravings. Oh, I wish there was something creamy in chocolate. That was actually the very first recipe I developed was a dark chocolate pot de creme. Also, it came down to, okay, if I'm going to remove a ton of ingredients from my diet, how am I going to maintain diversity? Because we know that that's really important for gut health. So I would sometimes start with the ingredient first and just say, okay, jicama, for example. Jicama is something that I tolerated. I know it's good for gut health. And so, what's the name of that salad? It's, a Baja chop salad, for example, started with a jicama and I went from there. Greens, I wanted to diversify my greens a little bit. So, okay, baby bok choy, I wanted something with baby bok choy. So just really, looking at the list of which vegetables were included in the book and make sure I was hitting on a lot of them. There's also, I understand that people in our community can be allergic to anything at any time, and it's also somewhat fluid, right? So, like radicchio, those chicories sometimes aren't well tolerated. So I make sure I've got arugula and kale and baby kale, which doesn't require like stripping and massaging. And I just am going for diversity of flavor so that there'll be something for everybody.
Amazing. I mean, your recipes are really gorgeous. They really, and you're exactly right that allergies in this mast cell community or chronic fatigue Pentad
Yeah.
community can be very fluid. So, and my background is actually Ayurvedic medicine.
Hmm.
And in Ayurveda, we say a lot, medicine for one can be poison for another, or medicine for you today might be poison tomorrow. So always figuring out what is the strength of your digestive fire? What are you reactive to versus what are you tolerant of? And years ago, I was in a functional medicine training a long, long time ago, 15 years ago. And the guy standing up was talking about food allergies. And he was saying, sometimes I just have the patient write down their 10 most common foods that they eat and hand it to me, and then I hand it back to them and say, "Don't eat these foods."
Yeah.
Because a lot
Yeah.
of times, and we do see in this community of patients that people end up finding like the 5 things that they can tolerate, and they just stick with those, which is fine. When people really are struggling either with appetite or with tolerance, I'm never the person who says, "Well, stop eating that if you've already lost, so much weight
Yeah.
because you're getting stomach aches or you have, You're getting allergic reactions when you eat, which can look like abdominal pain or gas or bloating, or,
Yeah.
um, you know, I'm talking to a
So
patient.
overconsumption, can overconsumption also become a problem?
Absolutely, absolutely,
Yeah.
because we have stretch receptors. So sometimes I have patients who say, "How can I be allergic to water?" And it's not necessarily the water itself, the nature of the water itself. It's that you're activating the stretch receptors along the esophagus or the stomach. And so those stretch receptors are then triggering mast cells in those same areas along those gut linings. Mast cells live in those epithelial linings of the esophagus and
Mhm.
the rest of the GI tract. And then they're degranulating, meaning they're opening wide their little stash of cytokines and
Mhm.
prostaglandins, histamines. And so I have a patient right now who's, blood, if she listens to this, she'll know exactly who she is. But, her blood pressure is elevating as her mast cell reaction. I have patients who I treat for something else, and we start on cromolyn. I had a patient who was post cancer and had some symptoms, and I started her on cromolyn, and she's like, I didn't realize your nose was not supposed to run after you ate meals.
Yeah.
Mast cell reaction. That's how I've been for 55 years. So
Wow.
I think that we often don't realize how much our food impacts us. And it is so dicey, it is so tricky. And I think it's part of why, we can't necessarily do this. I can't do this as a clinician in a 15-minute visit with a patient because
Yeah.
what are you eating? What is happening? And how do we fix it? How do we go about doing it? And, there's some obvious things like somebody has made a joke at some point that I can't remember who about like the all you can eat crab and pudding buffet. Like, there are some foods that shouldn't necessarily go together. And absolutely overconsumption or malnutrition, if we're not digesting it, we're going to just make symptoms worse. But figuring out what is the right things for us in this moment.
I think people in our community need to really dig into this and understand the complexity of it, like you said, but really dig in because there's untapped potential here to feel better, at least incrementally better, right?
Yep.
And unless we dig into it, it's going to remain untapped. One of the things I've figured out is really important too is to consider all the variables. So, for example, you can't, let's say you don't tolerate one thing, but consider the brand, the cooking method, the quantity consumed, all of those things before you write off a food. There's lots of foods that I can eat one day, but I just can't eat them for consecutive days. And there's also things like, for example, I know that eggs are a bit of a mystery for some people because they think, okay, I don't think I tolerate eggs, but wait, I tolerate them okay in baked goods. And so it's important to know, for example, that the proteins are denatured, right, at a certain prolonged cooking. And so it's like, try it in all of its forms. Even as simple as I thought I was going to have to stop eating eggs, I was eating jammy eggs every day. And I think people really love a jammy egg these days, but I need my eggs better cooked than that. So I was going to omit eggs, and it turned out they just needed to be cooked longer. They needed to be hard boiled rather than soft boiled. So things like that are worth paying attention to. Bananas. People sometimes think they can't do bananas because they're really ripe, and the riper they are, the more histamine and the more, I think, tyramine too, right? Is that? And so it's like, okay, they're not as yummy, let's face it, but perhaps you can tolerate bananas that are less ripe. So there's a few things like that. Even it, for lunch every day, I have an apple and a boiled egg. And I've even found that I have to have the egg first to act as a buffer for the fiber of the apple. I thought I couldn't tolerate apples, but as long as I provide a bit of a buffer before that. So, I mean, it's intricate potentially, right? But that's why I just say people really need to dig in and not give up because solutions can be found sometimes to these things.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And those are great examples. We underestimate the power of nuance here,
Yeah.
but that is really the world that we're working in with digestion. And Ayurveda would say that our digestion is most typically strongest between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. So if you give yourself something more challenging at that time versus at 6 p.m. at night, a lot of times early evening or evening, people's symptoms ramp up.
That's
But
so interesting. So you're suggesting if I don't tolerate something at night, give it a chance during the day, like 10 to 2? It's so interesting. See, I mean, people aren't talking about those nuances. And then people in our community end up just omitting all their foods, and there's not enough conversation about it. And I have found because there's all these Facebook groups. There's such a big community of us, and we do get really granular. But one of the things that people are sometimes resistant to is the conversation around food. And I think it's a lot of people feel like I've given up a lot. I don't want to give up food, or they're scared of like, where do I even start? It's just daunting. But I wish there was more conversation about it in our community for sure.
Well, maybe that'll be your second book.
Don't say that. I've asked everybody in my life to not let me speak such insanity. But there can still be all this conversation, right? And yeah, I just wish there was a little bit more of it.
Yeah, I totally. So the other thing that Ayurveda would say is that you eat to the strength of your digestion, your digestive fire. So if your digestive fire is not very strong or is too reactive, you need to eat gentler foods like, and I do have patients that like subsist on baby food because
Mm,
it's pureed, it's soft, it's easy to digest, or doing things that are, think of the pot as the first stomach.
yeah.
But the flip side, which we haven't touched on, which we would be negligent if we didn't, is that leftovers accumulate more histamine.
Yeah.
And
Can
so
I
I,
just, before we get dive into that, I'm going to lose my train of thought. What did you just, so in that same vein that you mentioned, is it true then that some people might not be able to tolerate raw foods, but if they just cook them, perhaps then they're better tolerated?
yep.
Okay, so histamine. Wow, that's a biggie, right? What were you going to say about histamine?
Yeah, well, leftovers, the longer a cooked food sits, the more histamines it has. So when I've had patients who are lower resourced patients and they're not able to order fresh food,
Mhm.
so they'll make a pot of soup on Sundays and they're eating it for 4 days. I've had some patients do really well with just avoiding leftovers, and so I recommend getting like silicone containers that you can, to save like an individually portioned size of food that you can put into the freezer, and then you can
Mhm.
just pull that individual portion out and heat to eat.
Do you find that are vegetables as bad? I think of meat as being the biggest offender when it comes to like developing histamine over the days. Are all foods equal in that way, or do you think that meat is worse?
I think a lot of foods are that way. A lot of the vegetables, like if you sit cabbage in a fridge for 4 days, I think histamines too, or lentils, or
Mhm.
yeah, I think the vegetables are not great as well. I think that meat
Even in
more.
their unchopped form, like in their whole form?
No, sorry, I'm thinking about post cooked. Like if you make a
Okay,
cabbage,
got it.
you make your cabbage soup, then you make.
Okay, okay.
But, no,
Um,
I think fresh will hold. I mean, and I think that, ideally, I mean, it's all of our fantasy, right? That we are eating organic, fresh, locally
yeah,
grown, it's not been irradiated, it's not come from, South America, like a cabbage does
yeah.
not come from South America to North America to feed us, but, I mean, we have to deal with our realities as well.
I mean, we're on the West Coast, both of us. I think we have access to really great food, and I know that that's not true of everyone. Well, yeah, I'm so there's definitely strategy to be had, right? And I am somebody with a strategy. I use the wet jars. I don't know if you're familiar with their glass jars. They're like those old-fashioned mason jars, and they have those glass lids. But if you ditch the glass lids and you order the separate plastic lids, they create a really nice airtight barrier. You can freeze them, and they have so many different sizes. Proteins are kind of the bane of my existence in that way. Like, I need that to build the rest of the meal around. So that's something I always keep in the freezer. And when I make them, to your point, once I cook them, I get them right into those wet jars and right into the freezer. Then I just take one out every day. So there's
Perfect.
definitely strategy to be had.
Strategy to be had. And I love that you're talking about the importance of protein because I do think people get tripped up by that. And you've just now like written a whole cookbook, which we know now is going to prioritize protein. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I prioritize it. I prioritize balance. And so for me, I try to have protein, fiber, carbs, not as starches. I actually don't eat starches, but I do eat lots of carbs and
mhm,
fiber with every meal. And I find that, for example, like most people in this community, my sleep is really fractured. I have to be really tight about my circadian rhythm and sleep hygiene and all the things. It's very unforgiving. So one of the things I do to get better sleep, and I really notice a difference, is my last meal of the day for sure adhere to the whole fiber, protein, fat, carb, all of it.
mhm.
But the protein, I think, is the thing that you really have to plan around. It can't be 5 o'clock, and you're like, what am I going to have for dinner? There has to be a plan. So, but I think the barrier is for protein. Protein's expensive. Most
Yeah.
people, a lot of people don't like to handle raw meat. It's all the things. So that's
Mhm.
why I would say if you're going to start with one strategy, start with a protein strategy, build everything else around that.
Yeah. So talk to us about some of the proteins and some of the protein, kind of how you've dressed the protein in some of the recipes for your some of your mains in the book.
Like, what do I do with proteins or which proteins do I prefer?
Whatever question you want to answer.
Any protein, everything.
Whack
The
away.
book, yeah, the book mostly contains bison, chicken, which is up to you whether it's pastured or whatever it is. That often comes down to budget. I do pastured chicken. Salmon, bison, and chicken is mostly the protein. I think there's one tuna recipe there. There's a halibut, and there's a black cod recipe. But the staples are salmon, chicken, and bison. So there's a bison meatloaf, there's a bison sirloin, au poivre, that's been coated in black pepper. Yeah, and there's a lot of, I think, main dish salads have become really popular. So there's a lot of main dish salads. Imagine it's like your salad, but then once you shred some chicken breast over the top, now it's a whole meal. And if you've got those proteins in the freezer, it makes throwing that together an easy process. So I definitely advocate for don't wait till 6 o'clock, even if you've got all of your ingredients. Do little bits throughout the day when you have to really watch your energy envelope. Make your dressing in the morning, come back midday, wash your greens, and make it so it's kind of an assembly situation at night.
It was amazing when I was in 2005 when I first went to India. The family that I stayed with a family that was known to me essentially, but what I didn't realize is she would have somebody come in every day and just chop vegetables, and I remember thinking, like, I would never hire somebody to chop vegetables, but I remember thinking, like, "Oh my god, it is exhausting." It is sometimes the barrier. I mean, and obviously, I don't have MECFS. I'm just, I have the life you had before in terms of, like, I'm a busy mom and I'm working,
Yeah,
and it is one of the things that I feel like stops me from cooking vegetables is having to take the time to chop everything.
it's
And so
true.
you're exactly right that if you're breaking that up in the day or if you can chop, if you're not cooking them, they will sit in the fridge and be okay.
Do
And
you
so
have a salad spinner?
I do have a salad spinner. Yep.
Love a salad spinner. And it extends the life of your produce by a lot.
Yes, that's a very
So,
yep.
sort of take care of your veg, spin it dry, line the salad spinner with lots of paper towels. You probably do that to wick away some of the moisture, and you can really extend your produce that way. And then it's also just ready for you to.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, you don't want to wash your lettuces and greens right before you use them because it's going to dilute the dressing. The earlier in the day you can do that. And the other thing is like when there's a salad recipe in the book, let's say you're only cooking for one or two, have your protein, have your greens, and just assemble your salads like con- multiple consecutive days, right? So if it's a recipe for four, you don't have to be a party of four. You can
Uh-huh.
use that to eat for consecutive days.
There you go. Yeah.
I think it's good to cook once and eat multiple times. And to your point about histamine, that might mean getting those leftovers right into the freezer. But again, strategy.
Strategy, strategy. Yes. Yeah. So let's pick kind of one recipe and kind of break it down a little bit. If we could talk about it, would that be okay?
Sure. Oh gosh, do you want to give me a classification? Maybe something that you crave or wish you had a recipe for, or would get maybe a lot of use out of?
I would love to talk about the charred broccoli and lemon tahini sauce.
Okay. So, oh, I forgot I sent you my recipe list, didn't I?
Yeah, you did.
Okay. So here's the thing.
I've been like salivating over your recipe
I
list.
can't believe that that's the one you came up with, but I'll send you that recipe so you can get started. So that's a really simple one. It's charred broccoli and it's just a lemon tahini sauce. You can make the sauce ahead of time, keep it in the fridge and drizzle as needed. But the thing that's cool about the broccoli is if you are somebody who roasts a lot of vegetables and you've got to get your oven turned on, wait for it to heat up, sometimes you have to cook it for quite a long time. Broiling broccoli happens in minutes and it gives you the nicest little bit of char on the outside without making the inside mushy. So, as many vegetables as you can learn how to broil quickly instead of roasting for an extended period of time, that's another way to essentially slam dinner onto the table, right? I'm moving quickly. I'm late. What do I have in the fridge? It's a really friendly last minute recipe. And then, of course, it's really simple. Oh, and the other thing is you don't actually coat the broccoli. I also do this with asparagus. You don't coat it in olive oil, you do it dry.
Oh,
So it comes out of the oven. And what's interesting is you can then toss it in a little bit of olive oil and it will green it back up. It's like brings out those verdant hues again. Then you just, so I mean, you really put it right into the broiler. You don't toss it with anything, and then you drizzle
that
it with
makes it
the
easy.
tahini sauce. So I think it tastes better. I think it looks more appetizing, and it's faster. So all those little things collectively. And I think when you cook from a cookbook like this too, it also, you become a more intuitive cook and you learn
Mhm.
how to apply those same principles to other dishes that you like.
Right, because if you have the recipe here is for the broccoli, but just like you were saying, you can throw in the asparagus as a substitute. So
Yes, there's a 10-minute asparagus bowl that you just throw the asparagus under the broiler while you prepare the other stuff and you toss it all together. So
fantastic. See, you've got great what you really need to do, I mean, not that I'm giving you more work, but it would be so great to hear you talk about each of these recipes. You need like a food member, like a cooking.
I really love to talk about them only so people understand what I realized during the recipe testing stage. So I had all kinds of various home cooks testing recipes, including one of your probably multiple patients of yours, but one that comes to mind, Austin. He's tested a few, and some of them are quite contrarian. If you don't tell them, and it's just human nature and force of habit and those things, but it's good to know that if you don't tell somebody why they're going to do something, they might reason it out and decide it's
Oh,
unimportant when it actually plays a really important role, especially if you're omitting ingredients, cutting the clutter of preparation, and you're left with these few things, they become very important things. So I try where possible, in publishing brevity rules, where possible. And some of these things I had to fight with my publisher about. I'm like, no, 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 these things can't be assumed. We have to tell people why or they won't do it.
yep, that's very true. And I cannot, for the record, I cannot confirm or deny who is my patient or not for HIPAA. So
Well,
just
I only used first name. I mean, I didn't want to, of course, yeah.
yeah,
But just
good.
first, yeah. But he is somebody who was a young person experiencing illness who was really dug into cooking his own food in his own kitchen, and it's been an absolute joy to watch. And he
Oh,
has done all these things that we're talking about. He's really discovered what he needs and how to feel better. And he's a young guy, and so yeah, it's been really fun to watch. And he's been a help to me because he's tested some of my recipes too.
fantastic. I really, Francis Weller, I don't know if you know him. He's an author and a thinker, and he does a lot of work on grief. He has a new book coming out, and I was looking at him speaking at one point, and he was talking about the primary satisfactions versus the secondary satisfactions, and just the primary being the things that we evolved as humans to do. And one of the things we really evolved to do was prepare food and share it. And so I think that getting back to these roots, I love your whole, I mean, it's not necessarily a system, but all of the steps of how you're doing this is it's like clean, clear, simple ingredients. It can be done in steps, is low, like not so much work to prepare, just like you were saying,
Yeah.
the desserts are like a bowl and a whisk. And then it's the nature of it, it's the preparation of it, it's the enjoyment of it. All of these things you've really streamlined. And I think that's a huge, huge gift to the community, to all of the communities, because even people who don't know they have mast cell activation syndrome, you need more diversity in your diet. Everybody is busy and tired in this world right now. And so even without any level of complex or chronic illness, it is important to have fresh and delicious food.
It is for so many reasons. Our food supply is not as it once was. It used to be enough to eat like our grandparents, but that's not so anymore because we're not eating the same food. Even when we eat the same foods, right, they don't contain the same amount of nutrition. And I think when you have chronic illness, you're starting at a deficit. And that's something that I wish more people understood too. We got to give our body every single tool possible. And this is one of the few things within our control. Too many things are just simply out of our control, environmental things and stuff, right? But if we can control the food that we consume, that's a step in the right direction. So,
Absolutely. And it's
can I?
interesting. Go
Oh, go
ahead.
ahead. Well, I wanted to ask you because one of the very interesting things that happened is that one of my recipe testers, somebody in their household had RA, rheumatoid arthritis, and when they were testing my recipes, they were solely consuming them for a period of time. And the person in their household that had RA went into remission. And so I've found that obviously this is something you can speak to much better than I can, but I found that RA is particularly responsive to change in diet, also somewhat Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. But can you speak to which patient populations you've seen respond the best to changes in diet like this?
I mean, I would say autoimmune disease. So, we do have an autoimmune epidemic, it's being called. It's very, very much on the rise. And when we're talking about autoimmunity, the big mistake that Western medicine makes is we name it by the tissue that it impacts. And that's kind of like naming anything in society on the victim of that crime, if that makes sense. Like, it is not the fault of the thyroid that there's an autoimmune thyroiditis or
I
Hashimoto's. It's
see.
not the fault. Rheumatoid arthritis is kind of like muscles or joints or connective tissue. MS is the myelin
Yeah.
sheath around the nerves. It's really the truth is that it's an erroneous perception and behavior of the nervous system and the immune system, of the neuroimmune axis, as we say. And so when we calm down the immune system in any capacity, meaning that we feel safe, and part of that, when we feel safe, then our immune system can calm down. We diminish the threat, and then we diminish the
Hmm.
attacks on whatever cells are being attacked, which is that's the definition of autoimmune disease. We are
Hmm.
attacking our own tissue. And we're not doing it out of spite. We're doing it out of our best effort to protect ourselves against a threat that we kind of can't totally discern. Might be, cancer is when a tissue is dividing out of control. And we make cancer cells all the time, and the immune system recognizes those erroneous cells, those dividing out of control cells, and takes care of them and gets rid of them. So if you've made it to 50 years old and you haven't had a diagnosed cancer, it's because your immune system has noticed those abnormal cells and gotten rid of them. Even I'm sure it happens, decades sooner as well. But
Yeah.
in autoimmune disease, we are attacking our immune system is erroneously attacking our own tissue, but it is out of its best efforts. And so if we can calm down our gut, if we can calm down the mast cells in our GI tract, then we can reduce that essentially wrong, what's it called when you're accused of doing something wrongly, that those wrong accusations.
You say, I don't know, false accusations. Are you saying the very best way to calm down the MCAS reactions is to remove the triggers, or is there a better way?
Removing triggers, I would say that the best way to calm down a mast cell flare or an autoimmune flare or any autoimmune disease is essentially it's a like in our clinic, it's a multi-step process in terms of you want to like specifically for mast cells, you want to work on stabilizing the mast cells, so helping them with pharmaceuticals to be
Mhm,
less overreactive, and that's something like
mhm,
cromolyn or quercetin or luteolin. You can
mhm,
also do antihistamines like H1 blockers like Zyrtec or Xyzal or Claritin or Benadryl
mhm,
or
mhm,
hydroxyzine or doxepin. And then it's also looking at how do we go upstream, which is part of that cell danger response, your work with Bob
mhm.
Naviaux, about recognizing why does the immune system feel so threatened and how do we reconcile that? And is the threat that we're perceiving, is this an emotional or trauma trigger? For you, it doesn't seem like it was. You were having a great time in life. Is this a pollution trigger? Like, do we literally just have like a wrench in the works of the metabolic machinery? And so our bodies are like, they can't get over the lead or the mercury or whatever it is.
Well,
Is
that's one of the things Navio and I talk about is just that our bodies are not we're not created for a modern world, and that's not going away, right?
no,
So
it's
for
not.
and I know that this is controversial, but there's a tiny, small population of people, for example, that don't tolerate 5G, but that's not going away, right? And I know that's controversial, but there is a small segment of the population, and there are other things in that same vein that you could probably speak to. But what happens when we have bodies that are not made for the modern world? That's disconcerting to me, right? Because a lot of those things cannot be. So I avoid glyphosate as much as I can. I eat organic, I do, but there are certain things in our environment now that can't be avoided. Do you have
Oh,
any
yeah.
thoughts on what we do when we're subjected to these things and it's out of our control?
I mean, I always think we've been humans on the planet for 300,000 years. And so from my perspective, there's always things that we can do. And some of this is looking at genetics, which is some of what Dr. Naviaux is doing. In our clinic, we use the Intellix DNA testing, which looks at functional genomics versus pathogenic genomics, meaning that I don't look at like a gene for sickle cell anemia or a gene for Huntington's chorea or a gene that is going to be pathogenic. Even the COL1A1 or 1A12, you can have a gene, but that one gene, it takes a whole bunch of genes together. And so the Intellix DNA looks at the PON1 and SOD2. A lot of programs do, but it looks at the functional genomics. So we're trying to put the picture together about why is this happening within the network that is an individual. So that's one component is how do we and what are the Intellix DNA is nice because it actually includes every gene that they check in their test. They include studies, published research that essentially
Hmm.
affects that gene by upregulating or downregulating it. So we can figure out is do we need to add in, what are the nutrients? What are the pharmaceuticals that can affect this gene? How do we impact this gene? And then we try
So
to
this test can actually identify whether it's expressed.
No, it cannot. No, it does not look at the metabolites and it does not look at the activity of it. It just
I
looks
see.
at the gene itself and then collates all of the data we have about that gene. So there's
Uh,
genes that like I won't hear about until I see them in an Intellix DNA test, but then I have a listing right there of all the potential interventions that have been researched and found potentially applicable to that gene. Then it's the intelligence of kind of putting, it's the training that I've had or the training that anyone who does the Intellix DNA.
yeah.
Part of it is, I use a lot of Ayurvedic medicine. So part of it is also using Ayurvedic medicine and using things like panchakarma, or which is this detox and restoration process from 10,000 years ago that's still in effect today. Or we have at our clinic, we do fascial counterstrain, which can be very helpful for Ehlers-Danlos patients or connective tissue patients. And the things that we were talking about environmentally can be the pollution, like microplastics, which we're finding in people's coronary vessels. We're finding atheromas
Mhm.
with microplastics in them, or it can be mold, or it can be
Yeah.
different organisms.
When it comes to microplastics, what do
Mhm.
you think is the biggest source? Is it bottled water or is it something else?
I mean, I think that we just live in a sea of plastic. I mean, we do. We live in a sea of plastic. If you try to avoid plastic, it is so
Yeah.
hard to avoid
Yeah.
plastic. And I think it's water bottles, but plastic water bottles, but it's everything. I mean, the computer that I'm using right now, the clothing I'm wearing, stuff in my, it's
Yeah.
book jackets. Everything is this. I mean, these glasses. I mean, it's like these glasses. It's like we are just in a sea of plastic. And I think that um, I mean, I used to think it's kind of like, it's tit for tat. You need to trade things out. And now, I've just been on a kick for like just less use of everything. We just don't need that much.
Yeah.
We have these primary satisfactions, which are the things that we've evolved as humans to do. And that is like eat together, sleep together, make
Mhm.
babies, watch babies grow up, do rites of passage, mentor young people, be mentored by older people, have rites of passage as adults and as elders, and death rites and education, and these kind of
And,
basic.
like, less consumerism, is that
Yeah, and the consumerism piece in what Francis Weller says, and what I've like, and what I felt for a long time, is that really we try to fill those things with those secondary satisfactions when we aren't
yeah.
sleeping in our crowd because we're in our house by ourselves. We should be hearing the sounds of like, people living all around
Mhm.
us. And now we put our infants in rooms by themselves and close a door. And how could you possibly feel safe as an infant in a room by yourself at a night, over a night?
Yeah.
We know that a saber-toothed tiger, if we are alone, if we are set outside the cave, which as an infant, you don't know whether you're in a room or set outside a cave. But I just
Mhm.
think that we have these components. And the risk of having my whole world shut down, I would say that's capitalism. If you're going to grow up and be a productive worker, you have to learn how to be by yourself and not rely on those primary satisfactions so that you keep buying those things that are part of the secondary satisfactions.
Yeah.
So, by writing a cookbook, by re-engaging with food, by having these conversations, we are connecting as part of a revolution to kind of take back our health. And that can be so restorative when people feel connected to that ocean of consciousness. When there are those deep roots, our frontal lobes can sense that. We come into the world learning, everything we do is a social construct. We don't get activity in the frontal lobe until months after being born in terms of, memory. And
Hmm.
you know that a child is healthily attached if there's a weird noise. And instead of looking in the direction of the noise, the child looks at the parent like safe, not safe. You know,
Hmm.
shit, what the noise was at some level. I want to know, am I okay? They look at the parent. And so just, I mean, and obviously there's weird noises and kids look at them, but just as I think, and that's what, when I was telling you, when I was down visiting Bob a couple of years ago, that's our conversation. And I think that is the second book of medicine. And I could talk about this forever and you can like do your box breathing and drink your
No,
water.
I mean it's fascinating. It is
It
utterly
is
fascinating.
fascinating. So there's an amazing book called Tribe by who is it? Wait, do I have it? Sebastian Younger. I stole it from the library. Don't tell the library. I should
I'm gonna
say.
make a note of that.
But Tribe, it's not a very long book. It was like a glorified article. But
Hmm.
he talks about when the colonists came to the United States, they met AKA the savages. I do not believe that Native people are savages, but that was the terms that they used because of how they didn't have all the stupid secondary satisfactions that people in Europe had. And what was so interesting is that when people, there was in the beginning, or, there was a lot of warring between Native people and the colonialists. But what they found was that when people were taken and then as children and essentially raised by Native Americans, when there were deals and everything to get them back, to get those white people back who had lived in with Native people, those white people would run away. They would run away to get back to live with the Native people. And it was not the same in reverse. When Native people were kidnapped by white people, as soon as they could, they would run away to get back to being with other Native people. There is an egalitarianism, there is a freedom, there is, when you think of there was a structure to the society that prioritized those primary satisfactions. And I am not, this is not global. I'm sure that it's not universal, is what I'm saying. So I'm not trying
Hmm.
to fantasize one culture over another. What I'm saying is that that was what was seen in the research. And so there definitely seemed to be enough of that pattern that it's curious. And I think that there are ways that we can amplify our primary satisfactions as ways to support each other's nervous systems. So
Hmm.
for example, the patient that I have right now, who if she listens to this, she'll know. But I try as she's having a mast cell flare, I try to make her laugh because if you're laughing, your nervous system relaxes. And so there are ways that, even when I'm doing, I was doing a ketamine session with a patient, a beloved patient who I adore, and she was going through some very traumatic work. And then at one point she turned and she said, "Wow, you're amazing that you do this." And I said, "How about writing us a Google review?" I mean, in the middle of her ketamine session, because I knew she
Wow.
would laugh hysterically. And I wanted her nervous system to be able to learn something different. That is how we shift. And so this neuroimmune axis, the medicine that we can do, the medicine that Dr. Naviaux is talking about in the second book of medicine is restorative, regenerative, connective, and we are built for it just as much as we are for anything else.
And I think cooking falls under that umbrella,
Absolutely.
right? You're
Absolutely.
creating something with your own hands. You're nourishing people that you care about. It's people that aren't as vocal about the way they care. It's a nice way to show people that you care when you make nutritious meals for them. Yeah, no, cooking is very therapeutic, I think.
And I think we're meant to have, it's one of those primary pieces. We're meant to hold food in our hands. We're meant
Yeah.
to vegetables. We're meant to, stir a pot. We are meant to plate a
Yeah.
meal.
Yeah, it's weird how I never get tired of it. I mean, truly, I'm just like, how do I never get tired? It just always fills my soul. I love it. And we do it every day, so thank gosh.
It is
Right?
true. When things are going well, we are going to do this multiple times every single day.
Oh, I do occasionally say dinner, you again. Weren't you just here yesterday? But I think, and one other, like, it's pretty off topic, but I guess I just feel like to people who still resist the idea of changing their diet, and there's so much I want to say about that, which is, I think one of the things is that ultra processed foods hijack our taste buds. So if you think that you maybe don't want to eat a certain way or you'll never satisfy your cravings, your palate will shift. That's an important piece too, is that as our diet shifts, our palate shifts too. I don't know, I just always want to overcome objection when it comes to that. So many people have not dug into that piece. And some people are more affected by food than others, but there are some people out there that could be feeling much better with a very different diet. But it's like you don't know until you try. And the other thing is, certain foods have a more insidiousness to them. Just because you didn't eat something for 2 days and you don't feel better, that's the challenging part of a successful elimination diet, right? Is you have to give it substantial time. So, I mean, some of the reactions I have are immediate and they're oral and they're overt. And some of the reactions I have are a day or two or three later. And those are harder to pin down. So I guess I just want to encourage people to not to really look more deeply and give it a chance and understand the potential is there.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And sometimes we talk about that, sometimes we talk about, like, the IgG reaction can be up to 72 hours later.
Oh,
So
really?
kind of sticking with one food for 3 days if you're trying to check it before you add in or try another food. And sometimes we talk about, and I absolutely agree with you that taste buds can change. And it's one of the, not to have everything in the world right now revolve around the GLP-1 inhibitors, which are like the Wegovy and Ozempics
Yeah.
and those and Zepbounds and tirzepatide and semaglutides. But we are finding that they can be helpful for mast cell activation patients in a strange way. I have patients who are actually trying to gain weight who do well to have been more stable on the GLP-1s, and there's going to be, we're working on publishing a paper on with some of that data, but they
Do
do.
we know what the mechanism is, or is it sort of unknown?
The mechanism is unknown to my knowledge, but I do think they affect they affect neuroendocrine hormones, and that neuroendocrine hormone signaling part of the endocrine system is also feeding into that neuroimmune axis. And so there's a sense of like feeling satiated with these drugs, feeling less hungry, fewer cravings, which I am totally, this is total conjecture, but that sense of like safety or lack of safety, if you're
Yeah.
satiated, you feel more safe. And so I don't know
Yeah.
what exactly that connection is, but there was a big article in the New York Times. It was amazing, talking about how the food industry, the processed food industry, is freaking out because people on the GLP-1s are not craving processed food like they used to. They cannot figure out how to like wind in and command control of those taste buds anymore.
Nothing makes me happier than to hear you say that. I'm not even
Right.
kidding. I'm so happy they're freaking out. I hope they're losing sleep because they're paying money at our expense, right?
Yep.
They're paying to take our health down, and we have to fight back with our wallet. And so I don't know if processed foods will ever go away, but yeah, that makes me really happy to hear that. Do you think of GLPs as being relatively innocuous, or is it too early to say?
I think that they can be really helpful for some patients. I think that I just read, I get a lot of news, and I think there was something like 25,000 people went to the emergency room with GLP-1 side effects last year in 2024, and I'm sure it'll be bigger as more people take them. But I think that's actually a small percentage of people who are actually taking them, and most of them were like nausea, vomiting versus something more serious. I do think that they can be very, very helpful. And I do think I have a patient right now who's been back and forth in and out of the hospital with mast cell anaphylactic reactions. And starting her on the GLP-1, she feels more stable. And so, in terms of keeping patients out of the hospital, interrupting anaphylaxis, I think that there are some patients for whom they are going to be incredibly helpful.
Do you think that the orals will eventually be or will soon be as effective as the injectables?
I don't know. I do see the orals being effective for some people, less than the injectables, less effective than the injectables, but maybe people don't need that much. And also for mast cell stabilization, my experience in clinic is that we don't necessarily need the higher doses of the injectable.
Well, that's good to know. So that's if somebody just needs a low dose oral, that seems really within reach for a lot of people. I know that for a while supply it was hard to get a hold of, but has that kind of fixed itself?
Mhm. Yeah, which also that is better. And for the moment seems, I think they're in process in these weeks. Here we are in April of 2025. They're taking them off of the I can't remember the name of what they call it, but it's like the endangered species list for drugs.
Yeah.
And but that also makes it harder to keep compounding them because the argument for compounding is like, well, they're not available. And now if they're
I see.
available, we can come back down on the oral compounded versions. So, everything's a plus minus. Everything in the world
Yeah,
is a plus minus.
that's true.
Yeah.
I think the pricing will come down eventually, right?
Yeah, we've seen the pricing like on the oral tirzepatide come down quite a bit since we've been using it in the last probably 4 or 5 months, 4 months, something like that. So yeah, I'm assuming the pricing will continue to come down.
May I ask you about salicylates and oxalates? Yeah, I'm wondering because we talked about histamine and also a little bit tyramine. What about salicylates and oxalates? Big problem or obscure problem?
Always about for who, which patient population. So I would say in our patient population, the Pentad population, I think it's probably more impactful, but I don't but for the general population, it's hard to tell what the prevalence is of the issue. I think that, when I first started out doing functional medicine, which was in like 2009, 2010, it was like I was learning like diet after diet after diet. I was learning the AIP diet and the GAPS diet and I'm trying to think the mitochondrial diet and the cardiovascular diet and which elimination diet and by who and when, and so there was diet after diet after diet, and what I've really come to is that it always just needs to be personalized for what a person
Yeah.
can manage, what their resources allow for them, not only resources in terms of availability, so many people live in food deserts, but also what their resources are for buying food, for how for cooking it, one thing I would still love to talk with you if we have just a few minutes left. I don't want to tax you too much.
Sure.
But talking about spices, because Ayurveda puts a big emphasis on spices as a way to help improve digestion, but spices can trigger a lot of histamine reaction or a lot of mast cell reactions.
Well, it's interesting that you asked me because it wasn't something I was creating recipes for the way that I eat and hadn't paid so much attention to it, but I've come to realize, oh my gosh, there really aren't any spices in my cookbook. I don't want to say any. There are more herbs and citrus, which is also kind of that whole California cuisine sort of thing, but there's not a lot of spices. And because it's shade free, that also eliminates peppers and stuff. So there are, I think, 5 recipes in total in the book that make it very clear, asterisk and all kinds of warnings that omit these if you are not eating nightshades. So there's like 5 recipes that have very tiny amounts of Aleppo or cayenne or red pepper flakes, but not a lot of like spices. This is not an ethnic book at all. It is very California cuisine, but not by design. It's sort of like that's just how I eat. And I don't think that's by accident either. I think that sometimes we're driven by our intolerances without even, realizing that we are, right? So there's not a lot of spices, which, yeah, for people who are, I don't tolerate any. Like if I have a single bite of my husband's falafel, which falafel,
Well, and so when you and I were first talking and I mentioned about spices and you were like, there are
yeah,
no spices. And from the Ayurvedic perspective, spices is much bigger than just like a powder with a flavor
yeah. What do
because
you consider?
I mean, you do use so many flavors.
I
Like,
do, but for example, I don't even use them because I don't do well with them and I don't even love the taste. I don't even use garlic powder and onion powder. I
yeah.
use fresh garlic and fresh onion. Yeah, so it's all fresh. It's herbs, it's citrus. There's flavor, but it's not coming from spices. Are there any other that come to mind?
I mean, I don't know if you have any ginger in any of your
There
recipes.
is some fresh ginger, but there's no dried ginger.
So that's the best example in Ayurveda. So in Ayurveda, fresh ginger every food has a taste,
Mhm.
a post-digestive effect, and some other things involved. But the post-digestive effect of fresh ginger is sweet, and the post-digestive effect of powdered ginger is actually very heating. Which is going to increase inflammation, which
Oh,
sometimes
interesting.
so all that to say, so for example, some of the citruses can have a heating post-digestive effect, except for limes and lemons. So those can have a cooling post-digestive effect. So all that to say, I just want to recognize that you have like very intentional flavors. This is not like flavorless food.
For
Really
sure.
fascinating, but there's not a lot of like dried powder. It's been on your shelf for 5 years kind of
There's
spices.
that. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's really none of that.
it's awesome.
So, yeah. Oh, I'm so glad that's seen as a favorable thing.
Totally, totally. Fresh figs enrobed in dark chocolate and flake salt. Come on.
There's no faux and there are no faux foods in my book. You know how you'll see a lot of like cashew queso and cashew crema.
Yeah.
I don't have any of that, but there is this one recipe where I've been able to kind of replicate the flavor of Parmigiano, only because if you're somebody who loves radicchio, it
Yeah.
kind of begs for Parmigiano. And so I was able through like nuts and vinegars and things like that to replicate that, but that's the only sort of, I guess, remotely faux thing. And that reminds me too, there is some vinegar in the book, but it's always the minimal amount because of the histamine. So yes, there's more citrus than there is vinegar and always the minimal amount. And again, that wasn't necessarily intentional. My body guided me through this in so many ways. Things that make me feel bad, of course, you stay away from. So, but there's lots of flavor, there's lots of baked goods. Some people aren't going to tolerate almonds. That bums me out to no end, but that is the primary baking ingredient that I use in the book. But to your point earlier about the ease of cooking when you have limited energy, there are no big Dutch ovens, which are heavy to lift. There's no stand mixer. I don't even know what those things weigh, but they're so heavy. So there's none of a lot of those things that are barriers are not there. And even when it
And
comes to like the print of the book, I had a conversation with the publisher about just making the print as big as possible, creating contrast, black and white versus I bought a cookbook recently that had blue ink on brown paper and it was hard to read. But the point I was trying to make to the publisher is just our community may need those things, but most everybody wants those things. Because
yeah.
even if you're not sick, you've got kids and you're busy and you're stretched thin. So everybody wants ease. So I guess I would just, all that to say that even the things that don't seem intentional in the book are very intentional and very thoughtful. Much thought went into every aspect.
I just love how you've put this together. And you even have like little gem salad with red grapes and za'atar dressing. So the red grapes are going to have quercetin in them.
Yes, and so does what's the other thing that has so much? Oh, red onions have more quercetin, right? Or shallots than yellow onions and white. So I do, and I actually call that out in the head notes too to let people know.
Fantastic. Oh my God, Rachel, what a gift.
If you want
And
any of these in advance, you've got my list. Let me know and I'll send them to you.
okay. And if you're listening, just know that, if you're looking for like the chronic fatigue cookbook, that's not what you're going to see on the cover of this like gorgeous, this gorgeous book. It just says in good health and it's beautiful. So I encourage everybody who has listened to this to get this book because it's fantastic. It's beautiful. You've done so much incredible thoughtful work to put into this. It's awesome. It's an awesome resource. Thank you.
Thank you. And anybody that pre-orders the book, when you pre-order, you don't get charged until it actually ships. I think people don't always know that. But anybody that pre-orders the book, if you email me your receipt, I'll send you 3 bonus recipes. So there's a really good chicken soup. There's a fudge brownie that's made with almond butter, and there's a cold brew coffee that you don't make the cold brew coffee, you buy it prepared, but it's made with like coconut milk and maple syrup, and it's really good. So 3 bonus recipes.
And chicken soup, just to mention, this whole the community often talks about gut healing and bone broth, but
Hmm.
when you cook too long, you're going to increase the histamine. So that is a good mast cell sensitive chicken soup is a very good thing to have.
Well, so tell me though, this chicken soup cooks for an hour and a half because it's got a whole chicken in it, right? And then you
Perfect.
take out the bones and the skin, but you've got to add broth. So what's your solution when you're making almost any soup will call for a chicken broth? How do you find a
Yeah.
safe chicken broth?
I don't know that there is one, but you
Yeah.
just always make it and freeze it.
Do you think there's a lot of problems with chicken broth? Is that one of the
I think
problematic?
I have not seen that in the last few years, but I would say the first like dozen years of my career, everybody was like, I'm trying to help my gut. And I put it in the slow cooker for 3 days, these bones.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like too much. Like,
No, it is too much. The other thing I've noticed is that chicken broth, it's really hard to find one without, quote, natural flavors, which are not so natural. So there is one I recently found at Trader Joe's. I'm like,
oh, so
wow, there's
good.
not a single faux ingredient in it, but you have to really look at labels and hunt down those things.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's very true. That's a great resource. Thank you.
It's
Thank
so
you.
fun talking food with you. Thank you so much because it's my favorite topic, of course, and I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate all the nuances with you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Any last thoughts, tips to share with the audience?
No, I just encourage everybody to dig into changing their diet,
Yep.
to not resist the act of big changes just to see what that can do for you.
Yep. Perfect. Good. Good, good, good. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And we
Thank
love
you so much.
Thank you. And we love that you've joined us today to discuss how to make our whole world medicine. We rise or fall together and are committed to sharing knowledge and insight that empower us and our communities towards greater health. Thank you for listening to the Nervated podcast for complex health, and we'll see you next time.